Felix Dodds has been engaged in global negotiations on sustainable development since the London Ozone Conference in 1989, and is a world-class expert in governance and in global discussions about sustainability. Please, Felix.
Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here. It was an amazing conference in 2002 when the network was originally set up, and it's good to see Catalonia and the Basques here who were also co-founders. And in fact, our second conference was in San Sebastian, which then forced me to move there because the food was much better than London, and the weather, to be honest. I mean, forced is maybe a bit too much, but it's a beautiful place to live, and I definitely recommend people visiting it. Now, what I want to do today is to, in a sense, give you an idea about the issues around the nexus. And I'm assuming I have to say next slide, is that correct? Oh, it's good to see you. So we're going to cover a couple of things, and I realized this morning when I read what I was going to say that I actually was going to speak longer than I thought I was, so I will try and cut this down as we go through. We're going to look at the nexus challenges, from Bonn to the Sustainable Development Goals, the narrative that was developed during that on the issue of the nexus, the differences between the Millennium Development Goals and the Sustainable Development Goals, the 6 foundations that address nexus issues. Then I thought I'd look at what the subnational governments might consider doing between now and 2030, give you some suggestions from my side. And that's the timeline as we move forward. So next slide. So there are a number of drivers that were critical to the discussion around the nexus. Those were population growth, which we've seen continue, though we will see it peak at a certain point. We've seen the rising living standards, particularly in China and in India, but not just there, in developing countries. And we've seen rapid to be an urbanized, we are an urbanized world, we'll be an increasingly urbanized world. I think they're looking at 60% urban centers by 2050. And this has created an increased demand on water, food, and energy. To give an example of a nexus, there are more than one nexus. It's increasingly clear that we live now in this interlinked world, and so isolated solutions are not allowed now, because in fact, we need to link everything together because they have impacts all over. You know, movement on one sector can have an impact on another. We see projections for 2030 or 2040 that we may need as much as 50% extra food. We're seeing that the estimates are that we might need something like 40% extra energy, and that there'll be a shortfall of water of something like 30%. These were figures from the Stockholm Environment Institute. And of course, then in addition to that, one of the challenges is that climate change is making it even worse or even more difficult. And so we need to be able to address these in as much of a coordinated way as we can, and regional governments play a critical role at helping to address those issues at the subnational level, both in policy terms, but also in communication terms, to help the public understand the world that they're moving into early enough so that they then are supportive of the policies that need to be taken. I live in Arizona, we're getting less water. It's not an easy state to live in. So if we can move to the next slide. So just to give you a historical perspective on this, because it's important. The issue of interlinkages has been around since actually Agenda 21. In 1992, the Commission on Sustainable Development, which was set up to review government's commitments and delivery of Agenda 21, dealt with it every year, but none of us thought it was a particularly interesting set of negotiations to go to. We would go to the sector negotiations because those were where we thought the advancement needed to be. So what happened was that as we got through the financial crisis of 2008, it really highlighted the issue of energy, water, food as a interlinked agenda. And so as we were moving into 2011 and on to Rio+20, there was a meeting at the Stockholm International Water Week in July 2010, where the Germans said, what can we do to contribute to the Rio +20 process? And they had been very important in the run-up to Joburg. They did the Bonn Water Conference that basically put the sanitation target into the Millennium Development Goals. In 2005, they organized the Renewable Energy Conference, which ultimately saw the setting up of the International Renewable Energy Agency in Abu Dhabi. And so they played a critical role, the Germans, in setting agendas. And so we gave them the challenge of dealing with interlinkages, which was not an easy challenge. But the 2011 conference was the first one which really came forward with some idea about how we might do it. And so the Rio +20 conference itself said that we needed to underscore the importance of the interlinkages among key issues and challenges, and the need for a systemic approach to them at all levels. So recognizing the role of governance in the context of that. The other thing, of course, that Rio +20 did was to set up the process for the Sustainable Development Goals. It said that we reaffirm to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, we need institutions at all levels that are effective, transparent, accountable, and democratic. After Rio +20, the text that was agreed on the SDGs was there would be a working group of 30 countries. Well, by the end of December 2012, Brazil were facilitating the setting up of this 30 government group. There were 70 governments that wanted those 30 seats. And so Brazil turned around and said, well, you better find a friend. And so you had some very interesting combinations for these seats. You had US, Israel, Canada. You had UK, Netherlands, Australia. You had China, Indonesia, Kazakhstan. You had Cyprus, Singapore, United Arab Emirates. You had India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka. This was brilliant. The Brazilians did an amazing thing because this meant it broke down the EU. It broke down the group of 77. It created a completely different dynamics in the negotiations, which actually enabled what is a transformational agenda to come forward. In the context of that, I co-directed the second Nexus conference. This was in Chapel Hill in March 2014, and all the key negotiators came down to Chapel Hill and we talked through the issue of interlinkages. And so you'll find interlinkage targets in the food and in the water, but you won't find it in the energy because we didn't manage to persuade the energy negotiators to do that. The Open Working Group in 2013 and 14 kind of worked to try and see what the goals would be. We know we ended up with 17. We know we ended up with 169 targets. The UK and the US tried to reduce that to 10 or 12. They didn't succeed. And in 2015, we had the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee. They never renegotiated the SDGs. They were dropped in. And what we saw was the wraparound text, which is altogether, the thing is called the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And it gives, I think, a really good narrative about how we transform in an integrated way, or forces us to think in an integrated way on how to implement these things. If we could move to the next slide. So I thought I'd go through what the differences were, because people don't necessarily realize that at the beginning, we had such a fight with the development world who wanted to continue the Millennium Development Goals and have an MDG plus versus those who wanted Sustainable Development Goals. So the MDGs just applied to developing countries. The SDGs applied to all countries. The MDGs addressed development. The SDGs addressed the 3 elements of sustainable development. The MDGs were sector focused. And the SDGs address the sectors because you have to honor the work that goes in those sectors, but also the interlinkages between them. And the MDGs address the problems while the SDGs address the symptoms and causes. And that was a crucial change. And the leadership came from developing countries. It came from Colombia, who were the lead. It came from Peru and Guatemala, who were the supportive countries at the beginning. So it was a developing country attempt to kind of get an integrated agenda. If you could move to the next slide. So one of the things that we know, having worked on the Sustainable Development Goals for the last half period up to 2030, is that they are indivisible in their nature, that we need to address all of them, that you find, if you're even dealing with kind of health, you're finding you're having to deal with water. If you're dealing with water, you're finding you have to deal with agriculture. So all of these things need to be thought of in that kind of way. The Nexus approach, I think, is really important because it really brings together the attempt to create synergies and address potential negative trade-offs. And we want to look where we can for positive trade-offs. If we do that early enough, that is possible. The longer we leave it, the more chances are that the trade-offs will in some way be negative at some point. We need to develop practical solutions, and we need to share those. And that's why a network such as Regions4 SD is so important, because you're all trying to do some of these similar things, but by being a network, you can share those good practices out, and that can actually amplify the implementation process. The Nexus has three kind of concepts of optimization, synergies, and trade-offs. But, you know, since at your level, you're dealing with water, you're dealing with soil. There was a book out last year which says we have 60 harvests left because we're destroying the topsoil. And so there's a whole lot of issues that interrelate, that if we can't address them as a coherent approach, we'll see our citizens having to address things in a different way. I'm going from here because we're doing a meeting, the Romanian government's hosting a meeting which we're helping with to look at the issue of nitrogen waste. And that is one of the biggest, it's the biggest overshoot we have in the context of planetary boundaries. And it is now going to be one of the big issues that you deal with in the context. I mean, I don't know if there's anyone here from Netherlands. Is anyone? Well, the Netherlands has introduced a policy on halving nitrogen waste by 2030. They've not done it in the most positive way. And as they're not here, I can say that. But neither did Sri Lanka when they did it. But we need to have a transformational agenda that does that. And so those are really important. We can move to the next slide. So this is where I'm going to have to cut because I realize I'm going thing. So I'm going to give you the headlines on this. But so the 6 foundations, and most of them are what I call means of implementation. They're dealing with cross-cutting issues, the need for you to get the right people in the room from the different departments in government so that you can address that together. You all are dealing with a rural-urban nexus, the need to be able to make sure that you're supporting policies that support both the rural area and the city areas or the urban areas. Governance is a crucial issue. It's not just about the regions, it's about the local governments at that level, even the parish level that we have in the UK, that all of those levels need to be involved in the context of making sure that those policies are integrated. The next one. Again, finance. So finance is crucial. Now, the question is, how do you ensure that you get more private money coming in? So things like creating kind of investment facilities for sustainable development within the regions will be a way of making sure that you can do that. More public-private partnerships, but the the UN Economic Commission for Europe has some principles for public-private partnerships. These are definitely worth looking at because they deal with public-private partnerships for the sustainable development goals. So you need to, in any of your legal agreements to set up these things, you need to integrate the principles of sustainable development there. You need to make sure that your policy, one of the mistakes that we made for the local Agenda 21s, which some people who've been involved for longer than more recently, after the Rio conference in '92, over, I think, 10,000 local authorities around the world produced local Agenda 21s. And the problem with that was that it didn't recognize in a sense, the ministries in local governments. And if you're going to actually involve the citizens in helping you to develop your future plans, then you need to make sure that it then goes back to the right integrated approach with the departments that you have, or the government, the committees that you have that are actually going to enact those policies. And then capacity building, helping the different levels of government, the NGOs and whatever, to be able to address those things. Next slide. So I'm coming to the end. So what I'm suggesting is that some national governments, what could you do for 2030? Work with your local and national governments to help achieve the SDGs. There are targets for the SDGs, but they also are asking governments and local governments and regional governments to develop their own targets. It's not just the targets that was set up for the 169 targets. It's also that they've asked that the different levels of government develop their own targets that are relevant, or their own indicators that are relevant at that level. You need to integrate your biodiversity and your climate strategies and your SDG strategies together. The EU will actually be producing a nutrient strategy, which deals with the issue of nitrogen. So that integrated approach, because many of the things you want to address will be being dealt with by different departments, and it's important to improve those together. Produce subnational reviews. Some regional governments have produced those. There's no reason why it should just be governments that are producing voluntary national reviews. There's a great need for the subnational level to do it as well, and to share those experiences and even the indicator basket that they use. To utilize Regions4 for sharing good practice and hosting where you can on your website, kind of Nexus toolkits, collect where there are good practices, where all of you have done things that you think you could share would be really important. And creating a technology hub. We're having such a massive change. It's estimated that something like 70% of us will be self-employed by 2030. How are we addressing the impact of these new technologies? What can you guys do to share that and the impact it has on sustainable development? My last slide. So the last slide. So this is to give you some idea of things you might be thinking of to work around. Now, clearly, we have a ministerial meeting on the Summit of the Future. I'm not going to go into that. If you Google Summit of the Future, you may want to engage in that. It does deal with some aspects of the new technology agenda. We have the SDG Heads of State Summit. Maybe the heads of regional government should be making commitments at that as well. Maybe 3 commitments that they will do in the next 4 years, so that you get them as a leadership to challenge the governments. There'll be a Climate Ambition Summit, which the Secretary General will be hosting. And there'll be a dialogue on financing for development, looking at how can we get particularly the private sector funds into delivery. We can't do it just on overseas development. Then we have the Dubai COP, which will deal with the global stock take. And then in 24, there'll be review of the global indicators basket for the SDGs. So if regional government want to change it, they should have a look at those indicators, see if they have some suggestions on what might be put forward to change. In 24, there'll be the Summit of the Future. And in 25, there'll be the 4th UN Conference on Financing Development. Last time, there was not a seat at the table for local or regional government. So make sure this time there was a seat, because they were excluded when we had the Financing for Development Conference last. And my final comment is on 26 and 27, which is the next time we'll look at these particular issues. You should be thinking about what you want in 2030. It should be used, that conversation should be happening. You will probably not have any new goals, but you may very well be able to influence what the targets should be for the new 2030 to 2050 agenda, which is likely to be the one. Thank you very much.